I haven't intended to make this video, but it's a very topical issue, and I've just watched a video which makes it quite relevant. The issue is Iraq and the wider Middle East. I'm going to show you a cover. This is Newsweek magazine, The Terror of Baghdad. So June 2014, we have a situation. Baghdad, Iraq is once again in the absolute quagmire of war. Now, the interview I've just watched was with Tony Blair, who remains a deeply controversial figure. There has been calls this week for him to resign as his role as Middle East peace envoy. I've mixed views on that. I can see the logic behind it. This is a man who continues to promote militarism, essentially, and he's a peace envoy, so there's an obvious oxymoron in that. There is a problem though with this. Anybody who is seen to say anything that appears to support Tony Blair, or George Bush for that matter, is basically treated as a freak with two heads. And I have to say, it really frustrates me that some of those, especially on the political left, but also people with no particular ideology, but who just, in my opinion, jump on the bandwagon, want to demonize this man without being really objective about the wider issues. Now, I'm no sycophant. I think that that's dangerous, to be slavishly in favour of any leader. And I absolutely don't subscribe to all of the views that Mr. Blair makes, but I do believe that he raises some very valid points that are often overlooked, and I'll give you a few examples. Firstly, the way that some on the political left talk, you would think that all the Middle East problems began in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. Now, if we look at the events this year in Iraq, which really began late last year in Syria, with the rise of ISIS, what it really highlights is this Sunni-Shia sectarian strife. But the way people are talking, you would think that this is a new thing, like it's something that's just emerged. The reality is, the Sunni-Shia strife is ancient. It goes back to the earliest days of Islam. And a lot of people might deny that, but it's a historic fact. And what Blair pointed out was that there are many conflict zones around the world, specifically in the Middle East, whereby there was no Western military intervention, and they still have Islamist insurgencies. This is a case in Syria right now. There was no Western military intervention there. Yes, there was a push for it, but there was no boots on the ground, there was no air raids, there was no Western military intervention. And yet, Islamists still managed to infiltrate that situation. Now, I believe that was a result of China and Russia vetoing any action on Syria, and I believe they therefore exploited the situation. And like so many Middle East conflicts, it's not a case of the good guys versus the bad guys. In Syria, from my perspective, it's largely bad guys versus bad guys, for want of a better term. On one hand, you have a brutal, unquestionably brutal dictator in Bashar Assad, and despite what RT proponents say, this is a man with a lot of blood on his hands, who's killed a hell of a lot of civilians, probably the bulk of civilians in the Syrian civil war, and who may well have been responsible for the Ghouta chemical attack. So Assad is no saint. On the other hand, you have an increasingly brutal Islamist organisation who's infiltrated the situation, who now appear to be more powerful than the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, and as we've seen with events in the last few weeks, have moved into northern Iraq, taken over Mosul, and they're pushing towards Baghdad. Now, the point that Blair is making is that Islamism is not something that just developed because of Western foreign policy. It's not just a byproduct of that. because it can be found in many parts of the world where there is no American, British or French military intervention. Look at the Philippines, look at India, look at Indonesia. There's many, many examples of Islamist terrorism, look at Nigeria for that matter, whereby there's been no Western boots on the ground. So how, if you want to say that, oh, it's a result of Western military intervention, how do you explain that in states where there has been no Western military intervention in recent years? That doesn't add up. I remember in 2005, Amman, the Jordanian capital, suffered a serious terrorist attack. I think it was 67 people killed. Now, Jordan's one of the most peaceful countries in the Middle East, one of the most stable. That was Abu Musab al-Sakari and his band of thugs who committed that attack. So again, that doesn't add up. If it's a case of, some will say that was a reprisal against the absolute monarchy in Jordan, but the point I'm making here is you can't simply say that, oh, it's just wherever there's been Western military intervention. That's a huge simplification of what I believe is a deeply complex problem. Now, you could argue that intervention in Iraq provoked this schism between Sunni and Shia, and conspiracy theorists will say it's all about divide and conquer, but I think it's delusional to think that America or Britain would get anything from basically having a war on the entire Islamic world. That's delusional, because it would be completely counterproductive. When you consider Islam as a major world religion, it's spread across the world. I believe the United States alone has 30 million Muslims, so the idea that there's some big Western conspiracy against Islam, I think, is completely baseless. I mean, Tony Blair has frequently defended Islam, and he frequently says the Islamists pervert the name of Islam. Now, I am not naive. I completely agree he's a deeply controversial man, and sometimes I also feel uneasy about how quick he is to consider war as an option. I think sometimes far too quick. But I just don't subscribe to this idea that some people have, that you can blame all the Middle East problems on Tony Blair, George Bush and Israel. I think that is an utterly absurd caricature, almost, of what must be the world's most complex region. I mean, it's absurd. These problems are ancient. They go back before America was even a country. So it's just ridiculous to blame it all on Tony Blair and George Bush. Having said that, I'm not saying that they don't take any responsibility. I believe the post-war planning of Iraq was a complete disaster, and they do have blood on their hands in that sense. That they did not take that as seriously as they should have. They were so hell-bent on going to war and removing Saddam that I don't believe they really considered the post-intervention strategy. Because as we know, it became an absolute quagmire in 06-07. On the other hand, you cannot nation build overnight. Now, there will be some who say, oh well, the Iraqis would have overthrown Saddam in an Arab Spring style revolt. But that's pure speculation. No one can be sure of that. Look at the last time there was a major uprising in Iraq, which was 1991. What happened then? There was effectively genocide against the Kurdish people. So the idea that the Iraqi people would have had the power to stand up to Saddam, I think, is misguided. I'm not saying intervention was right. I still believe that there's too many question marks over that decision. But at the same time, I don't go along with those who want to demonize Bush and Blair for every single problem in the Middle East. The problem with that sort of mindset is it then takes away all responsibility from those who are actually doing the killing, those who are actually committing these atrocities. It takes away responsibility from thugs like the Taliban in the case of Afghanistan, ISIS in the case of Iraq, and that to me is odious. The idea that all the responsibility must be on governments and not other actors in the field. I mean, anyone that believes that ISIS has no responsibility for their actions, You're kidding yourselves. Speak to the average Iraqi. Ask their views on ISIS. So, I think it's, I'm not saying the average Iraqi would exactly praise Bush or Blair. Far from it, but the point here is that I don't think the average Iraqi would have the same black and white outlook as some lefties in the West, quite frankly. The fact of the matter is, the Middle East is a deeply complex region, and to blame all its problems on two men, I think is just ridiculous. Iran and Saudi Arabia, let's not forget, are major actors in this as well. And I believe they should take a lot of responsibility in dealing with this current problem. It's definitely a grave situation. If ISIS takes over Iraq, that's going to be catastrophic for the whole region. So I think I don't think on this occasion there should be Western military intervention, and I think it's absurd for Blair to suggest that, especially given how misguided intervention was before. Having said that, something has to be done about ISIS, and I believe the responsibility largely has to lie on Iran and Saudi Arabia, because in the end of the day, they are largely behind the Sunni-Shia schism. And that really lies at the heart of much of the Middle East problems, and it's not a conspiracy, it's just a fact. I believe that's a much graver problem to the Middle East than the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I know that's a controversial statement, but I believe it is. So that's my thoughts on the matter. Just to conclude, I am not a sycophant of Tony Blair, certainly not a sycophant of George Bush. There's a lot of areas I think he's wrong. I mean, I think it's absurd for Blair to suggest any intervention at this stage, but I just don't go along with those who say that all the problems of that region could be put down to two men. And I think Blair is right to say that Islamism is a worldwide problem, because it has been seen worldwide. It's a fact.